Welcome back to my YouTube channel. My guest today is Elika Eftekhari, who's an attorney and Iranian activist. And today we'll talk about revolts in Iran that erupted 2 years ago after the murder of Jina Mahsa Amini, who was not wearing her hijab properly. This is the reason why it all started 2 years ago. Thanks for your time, Elika. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Would you like to tell us something about your background and who you are before we start with the questions that I have today for you?
Sure. I am an Iranian-American attorney based in Washington, D.C. My background is predominantly in international trade law with a focus on sanctions. Starting around 2018, I began working with more humanitarian organizations and charitable entities, predominantly those that were working in conflict zones. And when the Jina Mahsa Amini protests started, I began working with a variety of different nonprofit organizations and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that are developing the first ever ecosystem of organized strategic advocacy on the part of the Iranian diaspora.
Okay, so these days, these revolts are not in the news anymore because the talk about Iran is only about a possible escalation of the war in the Middle East. So there seems to be less coverage about the protests. How do you explain that?
So I think that vivid imagery of on the ground, that visceral imagery of on the ground protests subsided because of the mass arrests that took place, the widespread, intense government crackdown, and the lack of international media coverage on the ground. But that early media coverage in 2022 of the Jina Mahsa Amini protests actually helped support the momentum for woman life freedom to continue and result in outcomes in 2023. So, for example, starting in February of 2023, the 65th Annual Grammy Awards, an Iranian singer-songwriter received a special award and recognition, including the award being presented by the First Lady of the United States. The Sakharov Prize was awarded to the Jina Mahsa Amini movement and to Jina Mahsa Amini and the Woman Life Freedom Movement. The Nobel Peace Prize last year was awarded to Narges Mohammadi, an Iranian political prisoner. And just a couple of weeks ago, actually, DW and Vice News separately had detailed really significant, impactful documentaries that covered the situation in Iran. And last but not least, in December of last year, you had the first ever Iranian diaspora mission to the UN. So I think actually what's happened is, despite the crackdown, the Iranian diaspora is playing a bigger role in stepping up to amplify the voices of Iranian protesters through a variety of different channels and platforms. And that's what we're seeing today.
Well, in September 2022, when the whole thing started, the UN started a fact-finding mission to investigate the human rights violations in Iran, and the report is due out next month. What can we expect from it?
So, in terms of outcomes regarding the UN fact-finding mission, it's important to recognize that the creation of the UN fact-finding mission is in and of itself an outcome and an achievement. The General Assembly Declaration that covers fact-finding missions says that they can be created when the United Nations recognizes that a certain situation needs more investigation. The UN is saying we need more detailed information. And it's also a way for the UN to signal its concern. That was the exact language that the General Assembly used, to signal its concern about a situation. And so the fact-finding mission is really the United Nations responding to the Jina Mahsa Amini protests. And it's really a testament to the strength and the sacrifice and the bravery of Iranian protesters that a fact-finding mission was established. Because again, with a fact-finding mission, the UN is saying, out of all of the member countries, out of all of the disputes and conflicts in the world, this one merits special investigation. And then in terms of the report that is going to come out later this year, that report serves as an excellent evidentiary basis for future tribunals and other types of litigation that will bring the Islamic regime agents to bear for the crimes they've committed. So that's kind of a twofold answer. There's value in the fact-finding mission in and of itself, and the report can be used in the future in order to try to secure some measure of justice for Iranian victims.
Well, a few minutes ago, you mentioned the first ever Iranian diaspora mission to the UN, and you participated in it. What was the significance of putting up this event?
So what we've seen over the past few decades is that the Islamic regime uses or misuses its access to international platforms like the United Nations to spread its propaganda and its disinformation. And so what now has happened is, again, because of that momentum that is developing and has been maintained in the woman life freedom movement globally, both in and outside of Iran, we were able to rely on Iranian expertise in the diaspora and also reach out to Iranian political prisoners who have fled Iran as a result of the Jina Mahsa Amini protests, and together formed a delegation that went to Geneva for the Global Refugee Week. And this was really significant because what we're doing now is bringing a physical and visual presence before policymakers and world leaders to say, that narrative that you've been exposed to, there's an alternative. And this is the real voice of the Iranian people.
Well, let's start from the very beginning. Let's go back to the beginning. The protests were sparked by the arrest of a girl, as we mentioned at the very beginning, was not wearing her hijab properly. But there are many Islamic countries where ladies are not required to cover their head. So is wearing a hijab required by Islam, or isn't it?
So this question is kind of like asking a Christian person whether Christianity prohibits alcohol, or asking a Jewish woman whether Judaism requires women to wear skirts. And so the answer is, it depends on who you ask. And I think this question exposes for me a proof for the underlying reason to have separation of religion and government. Religion, as this question exposes, is inherently variable. It's irregular. It depends on a certain practitioner or a certain sect or a certain imam. And government requires equity and stability. And so when you insert something inherently irregular into governance, it causes a higher likelihood for oppressive outcomes. And that's exactly what we see in Iran today, with the Islamic regime using Islam to impose gender apartheid.
Well, speaking of gender apartheid, can you share more about what it means and what is the international community doing to help end it?
Sure. So gender apartheid really it's connected to, and it's an evolution of law out of racial apartheid. So racial apartheid standards were developed in the 20th century to deal with racial apartheid in South Africa. And today, the international legal community is working on evolving international law to keep pace with, unfortunately, the crimes of governments. And today, we see in Afghanistan and Iran that the regimes there have imposed a systemic, broad, government-sponsored, government-conceived, government-funded program of gender apartheid. And so it's worth noting that gender apartheid is distinct from just mere gender discrimination, because gender discrimination is ad hoc. But gender apartheid is something that is built into governance. And so right now, the international legal community is working to have gender apartheid recognized as its own separate crime against humanity. And for people who want to support this cause, please visit endgenderapartheid.today. That's the website where you can gain more information about it as well.
And we all definitely do. So the situation in Iran is such a mess that the government is doing horrible actions and they have to hide it somehow. So what kind of narrative is the government trying to push via their state-backed media outlets to justify their actions?
Historically, what we've seen and what we see as well today is that whenever the Islamic regime is presented with any kind of significant unrest domestically, it defaults to attempting to distract the issue by pointing to external threats. So you see in state media enhanced and increased coverage of things like, oh, the United States is the root cause of the protests, or this was a CIA job, or this is the acts of the United States and Israel collaborating, conspiring to do something. It's a deflection move. It's a distraction tactic, and so we are seeing the same thing today in Iranian state-controlled and state-backed media as well.
Well, do you think that the Iranian regime had a role in the planning of the October 7th attack by Hamas against Israel?
So I think the first thing that's worth noting about the Islamic regime's use of proxies is this regime in particular has really built a center of expertise around operating in the gray areas of the law. And one of those gray areas that national governments up until now have not been well equipped to deal with is the use of proxies. So we have circumstances where, for example, national laws are preventing us from adding the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, to the terror list in a certain country. Why? Because that country's definition of terror group does not extend to a paramilitary, because a paramilitary still has a bit of a hook or a connection to a national government. So we see that the Islamic regime operates in this gray area, in these loopholes. And this really brings to bear, and you see this come to light with its use of proxies in general. And so just like the situation we have with gender apartheid, where we need international law, unfortunately, we have to ask international law to evolve to keep pace with the crimes of tyrants. We also need international law to evolve in this regard as well. So that generally describes the Islamic regime's, the reason why it's using these proxies. It's because it's identified that it's a gray area. And then with respect to the attack specifically, the Hamas attack, I believe that most of the reports that have come out have shown that the Islamic regime most likely gave a green light for this type of an operation. Now, were they involved down to the nitty-gritty details of the exact day and time and location? I actually believe that asking these questions or trying to parse this issue out in terms of, well, how involved were they? Did they just provide indirect support of arms and intelligence, or did they provide a more hands-on role? I actually think that trying to answer those questions is splitting hairs and plays into the Islamic regime's hand, in the sense that because they're operating in this gray area, they can get policymakers stuck on disseminating and dissecting these types of questions when you have other examples in law, in other scenarios completely. For example, in the case law that's developed in the United States on contributory negligence, or the case law that's developed about the circumstances in which a bartender may be liable if a person who's drunk in the bar drives and crashes and injures someone. Case law has shown that in certain situations, the bartender may be liable. And so we have to ask ourselves whether your support is direct or indirect, it is support nevertheless. And I think this kind of speed bump that we're at in terms of parsing out these questions is a speed bump that the international legal community is going to, along with governments and policymakers, is going to need to figure out how to surmount.
Okay, well, in the last few weeks, the USA and the UK have been bombing the Houthi ships in the Red Sea, and the Houthi are supported by the Iranian regime. Can you help us understand who these people are and what is the role with the Iranian regime? I understand there's a lot to explain here, but if you can summarize and give us an overview.
So, the Yemen conflict, it's deserving of its own interview entirely, but just a bird's eye view, it depends first really how far back you want to go in history. Historically, the north of Yemen is where the Shia base was of the country. Sunni Islam was introduced to Yemen later, and Sunni Islam tended to occupy the south. In terms of the modern day conflict, Houthi rebels overtook the capital and displaced the government in 2015. And that also led to a Saudi-led intervention in the same year. And of course, we all know the horrific humanitarian crisis and the scale of that crisis that has unfolded since then. And I think, the Islamic regime probably views, yes, of course, there is this connection through Shia Islam, but I think the Islamic regime really eyes Yemen as a great strategic geopolitical location to have a proxy base. So I think that really explains their motivations. The motivations are absolutely never ideological with this regime. There's always typically a geopolitical factor at play. And I think that's where Yemen comes into play there.
Now, Iran recently also conducted strikes against Iraq, Syria, and Pakistan. Can you help us understand what happened here?
So I think part of this could be explained by two reasons. One, if you're the Islamic regime and you see what's happened since the Hamas attack, they may be trying to flex their various proxies to deter Israeli action, whether that's direct action inside of Iran or stronger action against various Iranian proxies or members of the IRGC when they travel, etc. So one may be trying to deter additional access, additional attacks and pressure on the Islamic regime from Israel directly. The other, I think, is that it's kind of signaling this is our turf to particularly the United States and any other Western governments that want to play a role in helping to resolve the conflict. And so I think the fact that we've seen these attacks take place in Iraq, in Syria, in Pakistan, as opposed to having three, let's say, in Syria, is a way of the Islamic regime trying to claim that territory and say, this is our turf to the United States. A way of saying, when there is a conflict in the MENA region, we want you to stay out of it. So I think those are maybe a couple of the reasons that motivate the Islamic regime's thinking in terms of escalating. And you see that it's taken increasingly escalatory and risky moves that we haven't seen before. For example, nearly having a major diplomatic incident with Pakistan. Yeah.
Well, do you think that these revolts in Iran against the regime can be a sort of Arab Spring for Iran and maybe even spark similar movements in adjacent countries?
So that's an interesting question. It's worth noting that the Arab Spring itself, which started in the early 2010s in Tunisia, was less than a year after you had the Green Uprising in Iran. And so I think that actually demonstrates and speaks to the fact that there is an interplay across cultures, across countries in the region, and movements inspire one another. I think in particular in these scenarios, in order to create longevity for these human rights and democracy movements, we really need the people in the diaspora to play a really active role in advocating and amplifying voices when the people in their home countries are unable to speak themselves due to oppression.
Well, the other side of the coin would be asking you, do you think we're going down the road of an extension of the conflicts, perhaps, even involving the war in Ukraine can enter this equation if Russia backs Iran and Hamas?
I do agree that particularly in the past few weeks, we have seen an escalation in the MENA region, particularly your preceding question about Pakistan and Iraq and Syria. But I think Russia in particular would try to my expectation is that Russia would try to stay out of it for as long as possible, because the risk of getting involved too early in what is a regional conflict is that it may galvanize momentum for Ukraine, which has been on the decline. And so I don't think that Russia would risk the gains that it's made in terms of territory in Crimea and in Ukraine for the sake of involvement in the current conflict in the Middle East. Now, that's not to say Russia has wanted direct access to the Persian Gulf for arguably 300 years. But I think that Russia would probably stay out of it for as long as possible, unless it escalated and became a broader conflict in more of the traditional war sense, where you have open conflict between national governments. And in that case, I think Russia may try to step in and take advantage of this situation, as frankly, many national governments do.
Do you think the West should intervene in supporting the revolts more than, well, actually, the West is doing pretty much nothing, so let me rephrase it. Do you think the West should intervene in support of the revolts, or would that escalate the tension and make things even worse?
So I believe that the West should absolutely intervene in support of the Jina Mahsa Amini protests and the Women Life Freedom Movement. In January of 2023, I actually tweeted about this, a statement that now has really become my summary of this issue, which is that maximum support for the Iranian people is maximum pressure on the Islamic regime. And I think it's important for policymakers to really chew on this and digest this thought and realize that providing support wherever possible to what the Iranian people are asking for in terms of freedom and democracy is tantamount to the pressure that we need to inflict on the Islamic regime. And so the forms of that intervention are plentiful. As you kind of noted, there's more that certainly can be done. So, for example, designating the IRGC as a terror organization. The EU Parliament has voted to do so, but the European Council has not. We see the same thing in the UK. The UK Parliament has voted to add the IRGC to the terror list, but the Prime Minister's office hasn't taken action. And so that's one area in and of itself where more can be done. We also want to ask national governments to support legislation. So in the United States, for example, we have the Massa Act and hopefully the forthcoming Tumash Act. Western governments can put pressure on Chinese banks that do business with Iran. They can put pressure on countries like Malaysia, which is a known hotspot for Iran's oil blending. The national governments can meet with Iranian diaspora missions to the UN and other international and multilateral platforms, and actually meet with them as legitimate representatives of an alternative narrative that is more honest and genuine, and that is rooted in freedom and democracy. So I think there's certainly more that can be done. For example, you've also seen probably in the media a lot of coverage of the billions of dollars of frozen funds and what to do with them. And you see this battle between, well, the funds should be released for humanitarian reasons. And then people who have due diligence concerns, excuse me, pointing out, well, the paper trail on humanitarian transactions gets a little murky. Well, I mean, you could take those frozen funds and apply them to humanitarian causes in other ways. You could expand OFAC's budget so that it can more quickly process and grant specific license applications to nonprofits and non-governmental organizations that are doing humanitarian and democracy building work in Iran. So there's a lot that can be done by national governments. Now, I will say this. I believe also that the diasporas play a really important role in advocating for this change that we want to see.
Well, on Monday, so a few days ago, the U.S. Justice Department announced that the Iranian regime had attempted to hire somebody to murder 2 Iranian Americans living in Maryland. Can you explain us and tell us what impact it has in the activism for the Iranian diaspora?
Sure. So, yes, the news was released on Monday that the Department of Justice has issued an indictment. And that basically just means the government is saying there's sufficient evidence to bring a case. And the reports that I've seen indicate that apparently 2 Iranian Americans who were living in Maryland, the reports that I've seen identified one of them as having defected from Iran, which makes me believe that's someone who was born there, born in Iran. And the second target, reports didn't specify. So it makes me think it may have been 2 people. One was born in Iran and one was not. The amount of this disgusting, as sick as it is to engage in the dialogue of value of human life, but the cost of the murder for hire scheme that the Islamic regime attempted to execute was $350,000, which this amount is kind of on par with what we saw the Islamic regime do just a couple of years ago in the case of John Bolton, which was another murder for hire scheme of the Islamic regime. And I believe in that case, the hitman was offered $300,000. So we have seen this behavior before from the Islamic regime. It's not new. I do believe that as the Iranian diaspora, particularly the Iranian American diaspora, engages in more organized and strategic advocacy, that will attract the attention of the regime and potentially put them more at risk. However, that being said, when you have more organized and strategic advocacy, particularly when you put your unity in action through the form of collaboration and cooperation, through as a diaspora, through nonprofit organizations, think tanks, universities, etc., you actually enable yourself to work more closely with local, state, and federal law enforcement to help prevent these scenarios from even reaching the point of an indictment. So I think the diaspora and the Iranian American diaspora is aware of the risk. They are undaunted. They are steadfast, resolute, and loyal to women, life, freedom, what I have seen at least for the past year and a half. And they will not be deterred by this. If anything, it actually fuels their being personally, physically at risk, fuels their sense of solidarity with Iranians in Iran.
Well, Elika, many thanks for your time. We touched a lot of points, and I think that we covered many, if not all of them, of the important aspects of this story. So I think that you gave my viewers a very good overview about this terrible situation going on in Iran. So thanks again for your time.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks everybody else for watching this, and see you all next time. Bye-bye.